So here we have the second part of our Israel keynote presentation. We have two more wars to go over before we're done. The next war we're going to talk about is the Six-Day War, which is one of the most stunning military victories in history, and in a matter of 6 days Israel manages to destroy the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria with a preemptive strike. This all starts really with the end of the 1956 Sinai crisis. And remember, at the end of that crisis, you had the UN armies, or United Nations peacekeepers, occupying the Sinai Peninsula to keep the Egyptians and the Israelis from going back to war. Now, Gamal Nasser, the leader of Egypt, the popular Arab nationalist, he starts off this crisis, you could say, by asking the UN armies who are in the Sinai Peninsula to leave. Now, by modern accounts, Gamal Nasser really didn't want the United Nations peacekeepers to leave the Sinai Peninsula. He just really wanted to look like a strong leader for his people and to look like he was going to crush the Israelis. Gamal Nasser likely knew that his army wasn't really a match for the training and discipline of the Israeli army. But, much to his chagrin, the United Nations decides to leave the Sinai Peninsula. So now that the United Nations has called Nasser's bluff, so to speak, there's no more peacekeepers in the Sinai Peninsula, and Nasser has told all his people that he's planning to go to war with Israel. So, to show that he's not, a liar or a coward, he puts a whole bunch of Egyptian troops and tanks and weapons in the Sinai Peninsula. So it really looks like Nasser is planning an invasion of Israel. And not only does he do that, but he shuts down the Suez to Israeli shipping and then shuts down the Straits of Tiran for Israeli shipping. And so now Israel has no real way to ship stuff from the Indian Ocean, and they have a mobilized army on their borders. So to Israel, this really looks like an act of war by Nasser. The leader of Israel at the time is Levi Eshkol, this guy up here. And so at this point, Israel realizes or sees that Nasser, on their western border, wants to go to war. Jordan would still like to see Israel driven into the sea, as would Syria. And adding to this mix, you have Yasser Arafat, who's the new leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization based in the West Bank, right? And you also have Egypt in control of the Gaza Strip here. And so really, Israel sees its situation, and not wrongly, as one where they are totally surrounded by hostile neighbors who would like to drive them into the sea, and numbers-wise have much more powerful militaries than they do. So Israel starts to create a war strategy based on the preemptive strike, to strike first in order to win. They believe that war is inevitable, particularly coming from Egypt and from Syria, and so they think they have to strike first. And really, their only option for a first strike is to begin with their air force. And remember from past lessons, control of the skies, air superiority, is the #1 priority in winning any war. And so Israel really can't match the number of airplanes from their neighbors in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Plus you have Iraq, over here, who has also sent troops into Jordan in case of a war with Israel. And so you really have the combined air forces of 4 countries against Israel. And so what the Israelis do in preparation for this is they train and train and train and train and train, and they train to use the same planes to fly between 3 and 5 airstrike missions in a day. In fact, the Israeli ground crews have competitions to see who can refuel and resupply a fighter jet or a bomber the quickest, and in the end, the Israeli ground crews can turn a jet around in 8 minutes. So Israel is planning on using the same air force to first wipe out the air forces of the Egyptians and then turn to the air forces of Jordan and Syria. And if their plan works, they will destroy the air forces of all of these countries while they're still on the ground before they can take any airplanes off into the sky. And the other thing that they plan on doing is before even they blow up the planes on the ground, they're going to attack the runways. Because if you blow big holes in the runways, the planes can't take off anyway. Oh, and by the way, our leader of Syria at this time is Hafez al-Assad, father of Bashir al-Assad, the guy in charge of the Syrian government at this time fighting the rebellion. And then you have King Hussein over here in Jordan. In the end, this strategy by the Israelis is an astonishing success, and they launch a completely surprise first strike using their air force against the Egyptians, and they are able to bomb Egyptian airfields every 3 minutes. They have a wave of fighters flying in and bombing, simultaneously a wave of fighters taking off, and by the time, and then another wave coming back and landing at the airports where they're refueled and resupplied in 8 minutes or less. They also attack right in between the first and second shifts of the Egyptian air patrols. They attack the airfields, in essence, while all the Egyptians are eating breakfast, and so there are really very few enemy planes in the air. And so the Israeli Air Force crushes the Egyptian Air Force. They then turn and crush the Syrian and Jordanian Air Force, and then they launch attacks against the West Bank and conquer the West Bank. They launch attacks against the Golan Heights, seen here in Syria. You can see how difficult a climb this is going to be up. I mean, there are easier ways than what you see here, but it's all a very steep climb and very hard fighting. And here you see the Israeli tanks engaging in the battles in the Golan Heights. And so in the end of all this, Israel ends up conquering the entire Sinai Peninsula. They conquer the Golan Heights, they conquer the West Bank, and they conquer the Gaza Strip. And so Israel, I believe they increased their size by about a third in this war. As a result of the 1967 war, Jordan, Egypt, and Syria negotiate ceasefires with Israel. And notice that it's a ceasefire, it's not a peace treaty. So Jordan, Egypt, and Syria would like another opportunity to attack Israel again, although the Jordanians are going to change their minds, and King Hussein is actually going to try to prevent future wars. And then you have Israel fortifying the Golan Heights and the Suez Canal. So now the Israelis are sitting inside the previous borders of Egypt, right on their most strategic waterway and one of the most strategic waterways in the Mediterranean. What you see here are the Egyptian soldiers, the Israeli soldiers at the western wall of King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Now, if you remember from our first lesson, the city of Jerusalem was supposed to be run by the United Nations, allowing for people of all faiths, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, to worship freely in the city of Jerusalem. The Israelis, however, used the 67 war and their victories in the 67 war and the momentum to conquer the entire city of Jerusalem. And this causes conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians right down to this day. The Palestinians believe that East Jerusalem is theirs, and it really is theirs by United Nations treaty, but once the Israelis, seen here in this modern protest, occupied East Jerusalem, they started building settlements in East Jerusalem. So they start moving in Jewish settlers into previously Arab and Muslim territory, and Muslim territory, Arab territory, that's recognized as such by the United Nations. And it's the Israelis' refusal to stop these settlements that makes peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians seem like, at this point, perhaps a faraway dream. And it's also what's driving lots of protests here, as you see Palestinians and Egyptians protesting each other in Jerusalem. The last war we're going to talk about in this presentation is the Yom Kippur War. And the Yom Kippur War can really be seen as Egypt's revenge against Israel for the 1967 war. And what happens in the interim between 67 and 73 is Gamal Nasser dies, and he's taken over by Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat's the guy who's eventually going to sign a peace treaty with the Israelis. Now, Sadat knows that his people really need a psychological victory, and that really can only come with a victory against the Israeli army. And so Sadat also knows that the Israelis outmatch them both in the air and on the ground. And so he's going to have to use strategy as opposed to numbers if he's going to deal any kind of defeat to the Israelis. So Sadat orders his generals to plan an attack against the Israelis, crossing the Suez Canal into new Israeli territory since they conquered the Sinai Peninsula in the 67 war, using the equipment that they have and not imagining that they're going to get anything better. And so the plan that the generals come up with is the only way that they can attack and hold any land in the Sinai Peninsula is if they only attack and hold 8 miles worth of territory in the Sinai Peninsula, so everything on this side of the blue line. And that's because the Israelis really have unquestioned air superiority, illustrated here by this Israeli plane. It should be a 6-pointed star, not a 5. So what Sadat does have is fairly effective anti-aircraft missiles supplied by the Soviet Union, but they can only shoot down Israeli planes within 8 miles of the Egyptian border here. So Sadat's plan all along is to only conquer 8 miles of territory on the Sinai Peninsula. In order to do this, though, he has to trick the leader of Syria, again Hafez al-Assad, into believing that he actually plans on conquering the entire Sinai Peninsula and driving towards Jerusalem, where he says he's going to meet the Syrian army. He knows this can't be accomplished, but the only way for Sadat's plan to work is if Assad simultaneously attacks Israel from the north and thus splitting their forces. Sadat also uses lots of trickery and intelligence work to make the Israelis believe that they're not actually going to be attacked. First of all, he sends lots of messages to the Soviet Union explaining how his military equipment is severely subpar, isn't working, and is desperately asking for more advanced weapons. Now he knows that the Israelis are going to be listening in to all his communications, so the Israelis believe that Sadat's army is in no way capable of launching an attack against Israel. And the other major problem that Sadat has to deal with is how do you attack the Israeli forces on the opposite side of the Suez Canal. Now the Suez Canal has steep banks on either side and water in the middle. And the Israelis have all kinds of big guns over here, right? And so any attempt by Sadat's men to come down one side of the Suez and then float across in boats is going to be easily destroyed by the guns of the Israelis. And so what Sadat does is he borrows a page from Alexander the Great, perhaps, in his wars in India, and he launches several drills. And so he amasses his forces over here on his side. He tells the Israelis that it's only a drill, and then they all come down the bank and get into boats. And then they go back across the bank and back up the hill. And so the first time that he does this, the Israelis mobilize all of their armies and get ready for war on the Suez Canal. The second and third time Sadat runs these drills, the Israelis realize that it's not really a war, and they send all of their people, or all of their reserves anyway, home for the Yom Kippur holiday. And the third time that Sadat launches this drill, on October 6th, 1973, it's no longer a drill, it's the real thing, and the Israelis are totally caught with their pants down. By the time they realize what's happening and try to mobilize their forces, the Egyptian forces are up the side of the Suez Canal. They've destroyed the Israeli fortifications here, and before the Israelis can launch a counterattack, Sadat successfully conquers the 8 miles of land that was his goal. Now when Sadat's armies stop, Hafez al-Assad gets very angry because he's fighting the Israelis here in Syria and trying to conquer down the Golan Heights, and he's quite unsuccessful at this, and he starts calling Sadat and saying, hey man, how come you stopped at the beginning of the Sinai Peninsula? When are you going to start attacking Israel proper? And Sadat tells him a bunch of lies and deflections about how he's got to, refuel and resupply and blah, 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 and really he has no intention of attacking at all. The Israelis, in the meantime, launch a massive air attack to try to conquer this land back, but Sadat's plan works perfectly, and his missiles shoot down any Israeli planes that come within 8 miles that he's conquered. Israel cannot reconquer this territory, and it's a really, from their minds, a tragic and unimaginable loss or inability to beat the Egyptians, who they really had very little respect for militarily at this point. Eventually, Hafez gets the Russians to force Sadat to attack farther into the Sinai Peninsula. And this is really where the Egyptian plan begins to unfold. Sadat, under pressure from the Soviet Union, sends a battalion of armor deep into the Sinai Peninsula, and they are destroyed by the Israeli Air Force and armor, and then the Israelis are able to cut in behind them, cross the Suez Canal, and start conquering territory in Egypt proper. Also at this point, the Americans decide to airlift massive amounts of supplies and weapons into Israel. And if America hadn't done this, there really is no way that Israel could have won this war in the end, because they lost so much armor and planes at the beginning. And so America's desire to help the Israelis saves the country of Israel from being driven into the sea by the United Arab Nations. Also, interestingly, leading up to this war, the leader of Jordan, King Hussein, tries to tell Golda Meir that Egypt and Syria are planning a surprise attack, an imminent surprise attack, but Golda doesn't believe him and doesn't prepare, and this is a huge mistake on her part. And they actually, at the end of all this, and this is seen as kind of a crushing defeat by the Israelis, even though they eventually conquer some territory, at the end of all this, the Israelis create a whole new government department called the Department of the Devil's Advocate. And their job is to come up with support for the opposite idea of whatever the Israeli intelligence is promoting, and so that they'll never get caught with their pants so far down again. Another extremely important development as a result of the Yom Kippur War is the increasing power of Opec. Now, Opec is an alliance of oil-producing nations around the world. Many of them are in the Middle East. And because the West, particularly the United States, relies so much on fuel from the Middle East, oil from the Middle East, that the Middle Eastern nations decided in advance to use oil as a weapon of war if the United States chose to get involved on the side of the Israelis, which is what happened. As a result, OPEC, for the first time in history, strategically reduces the amount of oil they produce. This immediately causes a huge gas crisis in America, as seen here, and there were signs like this all over the place in 1973 in America. Mile-long gas lines, people could only get gas every other day. This also actually launches the popularity of Japanese automakers, who were the first to design good fuel-efficient vehicles. I mean, before this, nobody in America really thought that fuel efficiency was an important trait in a car. You just wanted the biggest, most powerful engine because gas was so cheap. And so at this point, OPEC becomes super powerful. Fuel becomes a weapon of war. Here we see the Egyptians successfully crossing the Suez Canal. And here we see the Israeli tanks destroyed in this surprise attack in the Sinai Peninsula. Again, a huge psychological defeat for the Israelis. The ultimate result of the Yom Kippur War, in my opinion, is a peace treaty between Egypt, Israel, and eventually Jordan, right? And in this picture you have the signing of the Camp David Accords, and here's President Jimmy Carter here, here's Anwar Sadat from Egypt here, and then Menachem Begin here. And what this does is it stabilizes Israel's western border and Egypt's western border. Egypt gets the Sinai Peninsula, again it becomes their territory, and Israel gets recognition of their status as a country by the Egyptians. And this also happens between Israel and Jordan. And this is also why Israel, as I said in the first presentation, had so much to fear by the Muslim Brotherhood taking power in Egypt recently, before they're overthrown by the military, because the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't really necessarily recognize Israel's right to exist. And the Muslim Brotherhood, in fact, creates, back in its history, Hamas, the militant political group that's in charge of the Gaza Strip right now, and it has an on and off ongoing war with the Israelis. And so that peace treaty is vital, really, to Israel's stability and perhaps survival.